Coming to the next bone, that is the temporal bone. This is the temporal bone. Here from this hole is the temporal bone. The temporal bone, it is a paired bone. That means one temporal bone on this side and another from this side. So it is a paired cranial bone. It forms the lateral wall of the cranium. क्या करता है? It forms the lateral wall of the cranial cavity. It comprises of two parts. इसमें दो parts होते हैं. One, that is, this one is the squamous part of the temporal bone, and this one. This is the petrous part of the temporal bone. This one is the squamous part, and this one is the petrous part of the temporal bone. Now first, these two parts, they are completely fused, so they remain fused at the time of the birth. So now coming to this part, that is the squamous part of the temporal bone. Squamous part, it's comprised of two parts. One is the body and another part, that is the zygomatic process. This is the body and this is zygomatic process. तो दो parts होते हैं, body होती है, एक zygomatic process होती है. Now first coming to this body. So this whole, this is the body of the squamous part of the temporal bone. It is in the form of an oval plate. ठीक है? And it presents two surfaces. This surface, it is the external surface, and opposite to this is the internal surface. So ये external surface हो गया, and opposite to this surface is the internal surface, and it presents four borders. This one is the anterior border. Here is the dorsal border. Here it is the ventral border, and here you have the posterior border. So चार borders होते हैं. Anterior border हो गया यहाँ से dorsal border हो गया, and from here you have the ventral border, and from here we have the posterior border. Now first coming to the surfaces. So external surface होता है this surface it is divided by a crust. इस crust को क्या हम बोलते हैं? This is known as temporal crust. This temporal crust, it divides this external surface into two parts. This is the larger part that forms the temporal fossa, and just behind this temporal crust there is another part of this external surface that is overlapped by this occipital bone. ठीक है? So ये यहाँ पे दूसरा part है इसका, that is overlapped by this occipital bone. So this temporal crust, it is actually the continuation of this parietal crust. So parietal crust, this is the temporal crust, and this temporal crust finally terminates into a blunt tubercle. ठीक है? So this is the temporal crust, it terminates into a blunt tubercle. Now coming to the borders. This is the anterior border. This anterior border, it articulates with the parietal bone by the suture, that is the sutura scamosa. This is here the dorsal border that is overlapped by the occipital bone, and here we have this the ventral border that joins with it. This is the pterygoid crust. Here this is the pterygoid crust, and the posterior border here, it joins with the temporal wing of the sphenoid bone. So this is here the temporal wing of the sphenoid bone. So ये 4 बॉर्डर थे, एंटीरियर हो गया, डॉर्सल हो गया, वेंट्रल हो गया, ये पोस्टीरियर हो गया. Now coming to the next part of the squamous part, that is the zygomatic process. This is the zygomatic process of the temporal bone, that is the squamous part. This zygomatic process joins with the temporal process. Here this is the temporal process this side. This is the zygomatic process. These together you will form an arc that is known as, this is known as zygomatic arch. So zygomatic process of the temporal bone, that is the squamous part, and the temporal process of this zygomatic bone. So these together they form an arc that is known as zygomatic arch. Just at the base, ventral to the base of the zygomatic arch, there is condyle. This is the condyle that articulates with the condyle of the mandible. ठीक है, so the condyle है, just behind here there is a cavity that is known as glenoid cavity or mandibular fossa. ठीक है, ये glenoid, this is the condyle, this is the glenoid cavity or mandibular fossa. This glenoid cavity, it is bordered by a plate of the bone that is here, it is known as postglenoid process. This is the postglenoid process, and behind the postglenoid process we have this foramen that is known as postglenoid foramen. This postglenoid foramen, it is actually the external opening of, this is the external opening of the temporal canal. This postglenoid foramen, it carries the dorsal cerebral vein. ठीक है, so this is the condyle, this is the mandibular fossa or glenoid cavity, this is postglenoid process, this is the postglenoid foramen, this is which is actually the external opening of the temporal canal. So this was about the, that is the squamous part of the temporal bone. Then we have the next part of the temporal bone, that is this one, that is the petrous part of the temporal bone. Petrous part of the temporal bone, it accommodates the internal ear. So this is located or present between the squamous part and the occipital bone. So the petrous part जो होता है ये present होता है between the squamous part and the occipital bone. It generally comprised of one, this is the external acoustic process that encloses external acoustic meatus. ठीक है, this is external acoustic meatus. Then there is a, that is, this is the Hyard process. ठीक है, this is the Hyard process, and behind there is a foramen that is known as stylomastoid foramen. This one is the stylomastoid foramen, and auditory bulla or tympanic bulla is there, and here have the muscular process or styloid process. So now coming first to this external acoustic process that encloses the external acoustic meatus. This external acoustic meatus, then it leads to the middle ear. So external acoustic meatus, it has generally two parts. One is the cartilaginous part that is formed by the annular cartilage, and the bony part that is formed by the petrous part of the temporal bone. So extending from the external acoustic this meatus, there is a crust, a plate of the bone that will enclose a depression here. This one, this will enclose a depression here. Within this depression there is a small rod, bony rod, that is known as Hyard process. This Hyard process, it articulates with the great corona of the Hyard bone. Okay, this is the Hyard process, and just here behind there is a foramen that is stylomastoid foramen here. This is stylomastoid foramen. So it transmits stellomastoid artery and the fascial nerve. ठीक है, this is the stellomastoid foramen. The next structure that is of the petrous part of the temporal bone, that is this. This is known as auditory bulla or tympanic bulla. This auditory bulla or tympanic bulla, it carries a cavity that is known as tympanum. So inside there is a cavity जिसको हम बोलते हैं tympanum. This tympanum that forms a part of middle ear, and this tympanum, it is located between, किसके बीच में होती है? On one side there is a tympanic membrane and on the other side there is the internal ear. So this one is the auditory bulla or tympanic bulla. So extending from the auditory bulla there is the muscular process. इस side muscular process है, and on this side there is another muscular. This is the auditory bulla or tympanic bulla. That is the muscular process, or that's called a styloid process. So this is meant for the muscular attachment. Here two muscles are attached, tensor pallati and levator pallati muscle. They are attached here at the styloid process or muscular process. ठीक है. Later to the base of this muscular process there is a fissure here that is known as Glaserian fissure. ठीक है, जिसको हम बोलते हैं Glaserian fissure or petrotympanic fissure. So it carries the cauda tympani branch of the fascial nerve. ठीक है, so ये Glaserian fissure हो गया. On the lateral aspect, on here medially there is a semicircular canal here to this muscular process that is known as eustachian tube here. So यहाँ से eustachian tube आएगा that connects middle ear with the pharynx here, and from here this is the Glaserian fissure or petrotympanic fissure. So इसमें क्या क्या आता है? This is the external acoustic meatus is there, then we have this hyoid process is there, stellomastoid foramen यहाँ पे होता है. This is ये क्या है? This is auditory bulla or tympanic bulla. This is the muscular process या styloid process जिसको हम बोलते हैं, and here have the Glaserian fissure or petrotympanic fissure, and on this medial aspect have this semicircular canal that is known as eustachian tube. So this was all about the temporal bone, squamous part as well as the petrous part of the temporal bone. Thank you.